2025, a quiet commodity most people never thought twice about suddenly became front-page news. Potash, a mineral pulled from the ground in Canada, went from being an industry secret to the focal point of an international standoff. For decades, it served as the backbone of global farming, hidden in plain sight inside the fertilizers that keep crops alive. Without it, cornfields, wheat harvests, and soybean yields would collapse, and with them, the security of entire nations. On August 1st, Washington announced a 35% tariff on Canadian potash, transforming a once stable trade into a battleground. Within days, the ripple effects were impossible to ignore. Prices jumped. Farmers across the American heartland felt the pinch. Investors started pulling back, and markets braced for impact. What had seemed like a niche policy shift was suddenly raising alarms about something far larger. Was this really about trade leverage, or had the world stepped into the early stages of a global food crisis? The fallout was swift and unforgiving. What looked like a line buried in Washington's tariff sheets became a crushing weight on the backbone of American farming. Each year, the United States burns through more than 5 million tons of potash to keep its farmland fertile. Yet the country barely produces a sliver of that amount, only around 400,000 tons. The rest has always come from north of the border, with Canada filling nearly 90% of American imports. When the tariff hit, the numbers told a harsher truth than any speech. By spring 2025, prices that hovered near $300 per ton surged past $340 within weeks. That shift may appear technical on paper, but for growers measuring every acre of corn, soybeans, and wheat, it became a devastating blow. Fertilizer bills ballooned, input costs spiraled, and the thin margins that kept farms afloat began to vanish. Even Nutrien, the Canadian powerhouse at the center of the supply chain, warned that American farmers were the ones destined to carry the heaviest load. For producers across Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska, the future narrowed into a single reality: higher costs with no relief in sight. Was this really a plan to strengthen American farming, or a calculated gamble that could drive it closer to collapse? As costs climbed without pause, frustration in the Midwest spilled into the open. Farmers who had long endured the swings of weather and markets suddenly faced a government policy that threatened to break them faster than drought or flood. The National Farmers Union, speaking for tens of thousands of producers, issued a rare and blistering letter condemning the tariff. It was a striking move, a sign of how desperate conditions had become. By September 2025, fertilizer and lime together swallowed about 7% of overall production costs. A number that may sound small, but spelled the line between survival and bankruptcy for many family farms. The pain wasn't confined to financial reports. Falling yields in Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas cast a long shadow over the food supply itself. And when grain falters, the effect doesn't stop at the farm gate. It spreads outward, lifting the price tags on meat, dairy, fruit, and vegetables, pulling consumers into the very same spiral of economic pain that began with a tariff written in Washington. While anger swelled in America's heartland, Ottawa chose a different road. Canada refrained from mirroring the United States with retaliatory tariffs. Instead, it began quietly reshaping its long-term strategy, using potash itself as a tool of leverage. Policy shifted toward quotas, reserves, and targeted incentives. Nowhere was this more visible than in Saskatchewan, home to the world's richest potash reserves. There, the provincial government launched a program worth nearly 400 million Canadian dollars, designed to expand storage, build emergency stockpiles, and create a buffer strong enough to ride out foreign shocks. By mid of 2025, Canada had built its largest domestic reserves in half a decade, enough to cover 2 full planting cycles without relying on foreign markets. The effort went beyond protection. It created leverage, signaling that Canada would not be cornered. Along the way, the industry gained momentum. More than 1,500 jobs opened across Saskatchewan, injecting life into local economies and proving that potash could serve as both safeguard and growth engine. Canada's quiet maneuvering rippled far beyond its own borders. While the United States struggled with climbing costs and restless farmers, Ottawa was laying down the foundation of a new global trade map. One of its boldest moves came in Asia. By securing agricultural supply agreements with India and long-term fertilizer contracts with China, Canada guaranteed itself a foothold in two of the world's most demanding markets. These weren't simple business deals. They were strategic lifelines that ensured Canada's resource would feed not only its own fields, but also the hungriest markets abroad. Momentum carried into Europe, where governments reeled from the shock of volatile food prices and rushed to stabilize supply. Germany, Poland, and the Netherlands opened talks with Canadian officials, treating fertilizer not as a commodity, but as a cornerstone of food security. Japan, with its fragile farming sector heavily dependent on external supplies, also sought Canadian assurances that it would not be left exposed to sudden shortages. Each handshake and negotiation underscored how Canada had transformed potash from an export into a diplomatic instrument. Closer to home, even Mexico began rethinking its supply routes. Long tied to American chains, it signaled growing interest in turning north to Canada. For Mexico, the shift wasn't only about economics, it was about self-preservation. Dependence on Washington's trade decisions had proven risky, and diversifying through Canada offered a chance at stability. It meant shielding its farmers from political unpredictability while building a steadier foundation for its own agricultural future. The story that began with one tariff line in Washington had by then reshaped global trade patterns, fueled unrest in America's breadbasket, and redrawn the balance of power in fertilizer markets. The stakes were no longer limited to spreadsheets or price charts. They had seeped into food supply chains, family dinner tables, and the politics of nations across continents. And as the shockwaves of policy turned into long-term realignment, one question remained impossible to ignore. Was this really a strategy to protect American industry, or the first spark of a food security crisis no one was ready for? By now, the transformation was impossible to overlook. The G20's decision to classify fertilizer as a strategic resource placed it alongside oil and natural gas, giving it a level of recognition that reshaped how governments, corporations, and investors calculated their exposure to food insecurity. At the heart of this shift stood Canada, which controlled nearly 40% of global potash production and held a type of leverage few had expected to see from a country better known for timber, oil, and minerals. The question could no longer be brushed aside. Was the world watching the rise of a new kind of resource superpower, one built not on fossil fuels or metals, but on the minerals that make it possible to feed humanity? As America grappled with a deepening farm crisis, Canada's reality was starkly different. A torrent of global capital began to flow into its potash sector, with investors who once directed their money into oil exploration, tech firms, or speculative real estate, now treating fertilizer as the ultimate asset for food security in a world rattled by tariffs and trade disputes. The surge was dramatic. Shares of Canadian mining giants like Nutrien rose sharply, in some cases doubling within months, reshaping balance sheets and fueling ambitious expansion strategies. Toronto, long respected as a financial hub tied to energy markets, quickly evolved into the epicenter of global mineral trading. High-stakes negotiations that once revolved around crude oil futures now centered on fertilizer contracts, linking potash to the strategies of governments trying to safeguard their food supply. For sovereign wealth funds, hedge funds, and institutional investors, the logic was clear. Potash was no longer a routine commodity. It was protection against instability. Analysts began to argue that fertilizer had entered the same category as oil, gas, and rare earths, resources that shape not just markets, but the balance of global power. Rising concerns over climate volatility, population growth, and the possibility of supply disruptions only reinforced this urgency. Billions of dollars poured into new extraction sites, upgraded processing, facilities, and vast storage hubs across Saskatchewan. Entire towns that once feared the bust and boom cycles of resource markets were now thriving with new construction, hiring drives, and a renewed sense of purpose. Canada was being recast as the OPEC of fertilizer, a nation whose reserves had become indispensable to the world's food supply. For Canadians, the shift carried deeper meaning. It was more than economic growth. It was a chance to anchor national prosperity to a resource that every country needs, every single year without exception. Potash had quietly become not only a source of revenue, but also a foundation of geopolitical influence. What had begun as a tariff meant to protect American farming ended up creating the very conditions that weakened it, while propelling Canada to new heights of global importance. By late 2025, American farmers were still struggling under the weight of tariffs that added as much as $100 per ton to potash costs. That figure stacked onto already tight budgets, strained balance sheets, and left producers scrambling to survive another planting season. The squeeze did not stop at the farm. It moved down the chain, spilling into grocery stores nationwide. Food inflation, which policymakers had tried for years to contain, began climbing once again. Dairy, meat, and produce grew more expensive, and ordinary families found themselves paying more for the same groceries they had bought only months earlier. What had been promised as a shield for domestic industry looked increasingly like an invisible tax draining household budgets. The policy backlash soon reached Washington. On Capitol Hill, hearings turned heated as lawmakers clashed over the path forward. Some argued for easing tariffs to give farmers relief, while others warned that retreat would compromise broader trade goals. Each session became a stage for the deeper conflict, whether national self-sufficiency was worth the economic strain it was causing. The slogan of self-reliance began to lose its appeal as the costs piled higher, exposing not strength, but vulnerability. Instead of securing American agriculture, the policy highlighted how fragile it was when cut off from resources the country did not control.